So you may know this, in 2017, while I was in Playa del Carmen, Mexico, and recently I was there again, I'll link in the description to a few discussions we had while I was there, I made flow a priority. And essentially what that means is I made myself a priority. And by self, what I speak about is the self beyond the personal identity. What I speak about is true identity, existence consciousness bliss, Satchit Ananda, being consciousness bliss. So we could say truth consciousness bliss, peace, happiness, love, fulfillment. By making flow a priority, we could say, which is essentially being perfectly as you are. And we'll talk about how you can do nothing to access the flow. You can do nothing to affirm the fact that reality is perfect as it is now. While in flow, it appears as harmonious relationships. It mirrors, it reflects, it refracts out as people being in harmony with you. So we could say then, you prioritize yourself as being bliss. It appears as they prioritize themselves as being bliss. And together we experience what we could say is an amplification of bliss. Together, it plays out as harmonious conversation, harmonious, we could say, blissful life experiences together, as there is no condition in mind. There is no thought of separation in mind. There is no thought of condition placed upon consciousness, as pure consciousness is perfect as it is now. One of my favorite translations from Genesis 1:3 is the Peshitta Aramaic Bible translation, where it says, "And God said, the light shall be, and the light was." The light is pure consciousness. It is only the individual identity in mind, which is a construct, that conditions consciousness so that, let's say, the individual in mind thinks that if a condition is met, then bliss. If a condition is not met, then not bliss. So in other words, it appears that through this conditioning, the illusion is generated that the light cannot appear here as harmonious relationship experience, conversation, etc. So we can see clearly then that that condition is restricting the flow in mind, not in reality, as reality is perfect as it is now. Infinite bliss, spontaneous joy, spontaneous love, happiness, peace, bliss, fulfillment. It is only the conditions placed upon consciousness that are objectified, let's say, as experiences of flow restriction. So let's go through an example, and let's talk about how the individual can release identification to this identity, to be perfectly as they are, true identity, existence, consciousness, bliss, and thus experience bliss, we could say, emerging as wonderful, harmonious relationships from personal experience. So I get a lot of messages and DMs about relationships. And so one of the patterns that I have seen as I was experiencing life through a condition, so the condition was generating this pattern, as only the individual can place conditions in mind. So having placed this condition in mind, it played out accordingly. And then we'll talk about what happened and how to release the condition so it plays out harmoniously as reality is perfect as it is now. So the condition was that if a person says this or does something, whatever it may be, it means that I cannot experience bliss with this person. I thought, which is an I thought, that only if a condition is met, then I can experience bliss with this person. So, what it would play out as, and we'll talk about the condition, is I would see someone that I would be interested in starting a conversation with. So there was a condition appearing in mind. How so? As imaginal activity. What was the imaginal activity? Well, the imaginal activity was that if I go talk to this person, then they will reject me. And then when they reject me, I will experience suffering. So we see that was clearly a condition placed upon consciousness. As, is that how reality truly is? Well, we know now that reality is bliss. Existence, consciousness, bliss. That is reality. This is Brahman playing Brahman. All roles are played by God. So I don't need to condition this relationship. So through identification with that particular imaginal activity, it would play out to reflect that imaginal activity. Maybe sometimes they would give me the phone number where I would experience then conditional bliss. And then at times they wouldn't give me the phone number. And then I feel like I was missing something, lacking something, no bliss there, which is an illusion. Existence, consciousness, bliss, not for this or that condition. So no shame, no condemnation. I released that condition. And then the experience played out accordingly. I saw another individual that I would like to start a conversation with. I walk over to them and start a conversation with them. So that imaginal activity was no longer appearing. I was no longer conditioning consciousness through a particular lens of a belief of limitation or a belief of condition. So that imaginal activity no longer appeared. I had the ability to identify with that imaginal activity or not. I chose not to identify with that imaginal activity. And I remain in flow. So what could be experienced as a flow restrictor, which we could say the bliss was restricted as a result of identification to that belief of limitation, I acknowledge that I transcend that. I acknowledge in the moment that I spring from the sure foundation that I am bliss. As we've been discussing, that while in the meditation, you are aware of the imaginal activity, thus you transcend it. And you can choose to not identify with it for the meditation practice. Then you are aware of the void of, let's say, no thought. And then as you remain as you are, perfectly as you are, what happens is immediate bliss, immediate love, immediate happiness, immediate peace, immediate fulfillment. In that moment, you know yourself. You know who you are. Thus, how can you imagine then, from that sure foundation, anything that implies that you are not love, not happiness, not peace, not bliss, not fulfillment? That would be not accepting yourself. That would be not prioritizing yourself. That would be placing a condition in mind and thus conditioning pure consciousness, which is perfect as it is now, as it was in the beginning, and ever shall be, as stated in Genesis 1:3, the Peshitta Aramaic Bible translation. And God said, "The light shall be," and the light was. So, like in a meditation, as you are aware of the imaginal activity, you acknowledge that you transcend the imaginal activity. As you remain as you are, you know yourself to be, without doubt, without hesitation, perfect bliss, perfect happiness, perfect peace, perfect love, perfect fulfillment. And so, prior to the conversation, if this imaginal activity appears, I no longer identify with it. And what do I experience? I experience flow. Literally, I experience bliss. And by that I mean specifically, as you experience bliss during a meditation, prior to starting a conversation with a person, during the conversation with the person, after the conversation with a person, as there is no limitations in mind, no conditions placed upon consciousness, as pure consciousness is perfect as it is now. They are pure consciousness, you are pure consciousness, as you were in the beginning, now, and ever shall be. As in the end, there's only God. The experience is embodied. It's an embodied experience, physically, emotionally, mentally, and spiritually integrated. There is a neurotransmitter that is released while you're in flow. It is also released while in a meditation by doing nothing. And by that I mean specifically acknowledging the fact that you are all that you desire to be. You have all that you desire. You are perfect love, happiness, peace, bliss, fulfillment for no reason. Not for this or that condition. Not for this or that reason. Existence, consciousness, bliss. This is Brahman playing Brahman. Blissful play of God, we could say. So this neurotransmitter is released. It's called anandamide. Anandamide. It's named after the Sanskrit word ananda, which can be translated to bliss, happiness, peace. This is where, like, for example, Ramana Maharshi, you are happiness, you are happiness. As the individual acknowledges the self beyond limitations, beyond restrictions, limitless self, the self beyond condition, the same self, you and I are no different. There is no separation. There is no condition. You and I are the same, perfectly as we are now, existing as bliss. So then what happens is the conversation flows. You see an individual you would like to start a conversation with, you walk over and start a conversation. If they say this, bliss. If they say that, bliss. Not conditioning the appearances. Now, what's interesting about that, and not to throw a bias into the equation, but whatever plays out in perfect harmony. So from personal experience, what I notice is they do give the phone number. They do, we could say, appear to desire to be in contact with you. And we can come up with a logical explanation. They might even say it. They might say, wow, your presence, the way I feel around you, that is why. What is being pointed to is both individuals in the moment experiencing bliss, no separation from bliss. And a theater plays out. It's the perfect play of God. The perfect play of God playing out as harmonious conversation, as harmonious relationships. So this is what I mean by I do nothing while in flow to affirm that reality is perfect as it is now. Why do I need to try to affirm or deny reality is perfect as it is now? It is perfect as it is now. This is why, when I mentioned earlier, When I made flow a priority, I look back at my life, I said, when was I the happiest, joyous? Everything appeared to flow without trying, without forcing, without needing to control. It was while I was in flow. And I asked myself a simple question, and you can ask yourself the simple question as well. What if I make flow a priority? Another way of saying it is, what if I allow myself to be? What if I don't identify with this illusory personal identity in mind that seems to suggest that I need to do this or that in order to experience bliss? What if I release those conditions? Well, what happens is body naturally flows. Body appears to do what body appears to do. That's the experience of, let's say, complete surrender to bliss. There's no need to try for body to be perfect as it is in flow. There's no need to pretend for body to be perfect as it is in flow. There's no need to fake or put on a persona or, as mentioned, the individual identity persona. There's no need to wear that mask. Drop it in the moment. Practically speaking, is, let's say, if the individual experiences emotions as, let's say, they would interpret it as awkward, they think that they are awkward, that is an illusion. You are not awkward. Who is it that suggests that you are awkward? Those suggestions arise from beliefs in mind and may even play out in mind as, let's say, convincing imaginal activity arising from that personal identity, which is not real. We could say that personal identity is fluid, yet you transcend it. This is why I teach, do not form an identity around appearances. Do not form an identity, for example, if you're an entrepreneur and you've created a lot of success and you have a lot of money in your bank account, do not form an identity around that money. Because let's say if the markets go up and down, the individual experiences suffering, which is generated by this personal identity. If the individual was not identified with the appearances or the personal identity, it would flow. And actually, they may discover, as I have as well, I trust you notice this as well, that while the markets go down or whatever, up and down, there are opportunities. There are opportunities, let's say, when appearances change. If the market shifts in this direction, there are opportunities. If it shifts in that direction, there are opportunities. Same can be said about any pendulum swing. If it goes in this direction, great, opportunities. If it goes in this direction, great, opportunities. So with respect to relationships, how could it play out? Unconditional bliss. Well, I have noticed this a number of times, and I trust you have noticed this as well. You see someone you're interested in starting a conversation with. You flow over and start a conversation with them. No need to do this or that to go over there and start a conversation, we could say. Body moves naturally as you relax into the flow. If, let's say, the individual in mind says they feel awkward, who is that suggests they are awkward? No shame, no condemnation. That is certainly not true identity. True identity is beyond these conditions. This is the play of God. Everything happens perfectly, as it is now. Thus you are perfect as you are now. They are perfect as it is now. Pure consciousness playing out as theater, perfectly as it is now. I allow it to be. I allow them to be. I allow myself to be. I relax into the flow. Walk over, start the conversation. The conversation flows. That is the result of releasing the conditions placed upon consciousness. I used to run an IT business from 2009 to 13, And I transitioned from that to go into consulting. If I was identified with that identity construct, that personal identity that said, you know what, this is my style of entrepreneurship, and there's no way I could do any other kind of entrepreneurship. This is all I know. That is an illusion. Then I would force myself to continue to remain in the IT business. Now, I genuinely enjoyed running the IT business and building it from 2009 to 13 to success. Yet naturally what arose was the genuine desire to move into consulting, to start this YouTube channel. If I didn't listen to myself at that particular point, make flow a priority, as I said, make yourself a priority, I would have come up with all kinds of reasons, which again is not me really thinking. That's the personal identity, the one that, let's say, the individual can praise. They try, let's say, to do all kinds of things to preserve this personal identity, which is an illusory identity, because maybe the individual in mind is afraid. That's not you being afraid. Release those conditions, and that personal identity dissolves. If I was deeply identified with that personal identity construct, what would happen, maybe we could say, is that I would convince myself as to staying in this IT business, even though the desire of the heart said transition away from it. And I'm glad I did. So yeah, these were part of the reflections that I had when I was in 2017 in Playa del Carmen, Mexico, and I made flow a priority. So again, let's go back to the example of relationships and conversations. You walk over, you start the conversation. If there's imaginal activity that suggests otherwise, that you are not love, happiness, peace, bliss, fulfillment, no longer identify with it and continue to flow and have that conversation with the person. And you have the conversation with the person, the conversation plays out harmoniously. As you are in flow, I trust you notice this, as you don't identify with these conditions prior to the conversation, also if they appear during the conversation in relation to what the person says, doesn't say, doesn't do, you allow things to be, we could say, perfectly as they are. And the conversation plays out perfectly as it does, as this is the play of God. God does everything. It is only the illusions of I that thinks that the individual in mind has to control something, force something, manipulate something to get that person to do something that they think that that person should do. All of that does not need to be there. It plays out perfectly. I trust you notice this. It plays out as perfection. This is why Brahman is referred to as absolute reality or ultimate reality. Brahman appearing to play Brahman. That's reality. As you are reality, you are perfect as you are now. They are perfect as it is now. Everything appears to be perfect as it is now. This is a real experience. The experience of Brahman is a real experience. While you're in flow, clearly there is no thoughts of separation in mind. No thought of separation. No thought of condition. Because experientially, we acknowledge that those conditions don't need to be there. And so we don't need to affirm or deny. Reality is perfect as it is now, like is mentioned during a meditation. If this illusory activity appears in mind, these illusory imaginal activities suggesting limitation, suggesting conditions need to be there. In order to experience bliss, appear in mind, they appear to disappear. You acknowledge true identity in the moment as existence consciousness bliss. And just as you can experience yourself as bliss, anandamide is released, as bliss while in the meditation, you experience yourself as bliss, appearing as blissful, harmonious relationship. We can say they experience their self as you experience yourself. It is the same self playing out as theater. The self is perfect as it is now. They are perfect as they are now. As mind is purified by releasing these conditions placed upon consciousness, reality is experienced. Practically, this is a practical experience. The experience of Brahman is real. It's a real experience. We could say, and I acknowledge it, it is the realest experience. This is the realest conversation I could have with you. This is the realest conversation I could have with them. Those conditions distort reality. So I release them. And then I really experience the relationship. And it plays out in all kinds of mutually harmonious, wonderful ways. So I trust you found this video to be helpful. Let's conclude this with an auto-suggestion to further encourage. You could say, I acknowledge that I am perfect as I am. Reality is perfect as it is now, as individuals that appear from the sure foundation that I am, the sure foundation that they are bliss, appear to be blissful relationships, harmonious relationships with increasing frequency on a continuous basis as far as the senses perceive, appearing as wonderful relationships wherever I am. As wherever I am, there I am as bliss, as they are, as bliss now.